All right, here we go. Later today, could be late afternoon, so don't get antsy on me. Later today, quiz number 2 will be posted online. Quiz number 2 will be the same type format. Everything will be included. The first time, because we did the split thing, I separated discussion questions, but that won't be true this time. So discussion questions will be in the quiz that opens up for you. There'll be 60 minutes to take it. There'll be a lot of questions, more than 60. So everybody clear on that? Any questions about that? Anybody? If you do, you email me. Yes, sir?
When is it due?
I will make it due midnight Saturday. Everybody okay with that? Is that long enough? Like I said, you need to, just like, it's even more important. Of course, Robert did the first one this way. You got to make sure you're uninterrupted. So, whatever that means for you, whether it's going into your room, if you got a private, you know what I mean? You just need to focus and be uninterrupted during your time. So, don't do it when your favorite TV show comes on, whatever, so plan ahead. Probably I will wait until after Friday's class to post exam 1, okay? And I will make it due, I'm thinking Wednesday night, next Wednesday at midnight. Is that okay? Do you need till Thursday? I could do it till Thursday if you prefer. You got a preference? You will have longer than 60 minutes. I haven't decided if it'd be 75 or 90 or something in between, but it will be a longer test. There'll be more questions because it'll be over chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? That means things I've said in class, things in our textbook. That's pretty much the focus and the like, okay? Any questions? We're ready for chapter 5. The colonists want to be free, and free indeed. All right. Do you need the power? Do you think you need the power for it? Let's find out. Pull it this way. Go around the other way. I will do this. Okay, you are up. You're on the big screen. Do you have power? No. Oh, so you need it. Okay. Then let's just pull it this way. Okay, you can use this if you want to. Put it up here. We have room. Is that good? All right, you feel good? How about your setup? All right. And I'll remind you every time after you present, email me your PowerPoint.
Okay, so this is the American Revolution.
I think you can take your mask off so we can.
This is the American Revolution. Some of the main points is obviously the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the War for Independence, the Age of Revolution, War in Society, Abigail Adams, the creation of state governments, and the search for national government. The American Revolution started in 1775 and ended in 1783. It's the day we became an independent nation. Political, social, and military aspects had a lot to do with it. Social and economic phenomenon. And Carl Becker posed 2 questions shaping the revolution: a home rule, and B, who should rule at home. The Declaration of Independence. Independence was declared. United colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent. 1781, most states had produced their own. By 1781, most states had produced their own constitutions. The Articles of Confederation had set in November 1777, and Thomas Jefferson, with the help of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, were the ones who set and write mostly. The War for Independence. The first phase was New England. It started in 1775 and ended in 1776. And Bunker Hill is where it was. And the second phase is the Mid-Atlantic region, starting in 1776 and ended in 1778. And the British were set to win, but due to some of the diseases and stuff that caught up to them, they actually had a hard falling. Securing the aid from abroad, it had a lot to do with the French diplomatic recognition, and the final phase was Britain's southern strategy. The Age of Revolution inspired uprising in other parts of the Atlantic world, overturning of the old system and regimes and creation of new ones. Religious toleration and freedom of thought. In 1821, Mexico becomes an independent nation. 1822, Brazil's independence happened. An Enlightenment era, political and legal equality for all. Loyalists and minorities, the war in society. The Loyalists' plight in Canada, Quakers, the war in slavery, exposures to revolutionary ideas, slaves, and 1799 New York, and in 1804 in New Jersey, they both became independent. Native Americans and the Revolution had noble savages. Women's rights and roles. They were mainly in charge of the farms and businesses, while their husbands or the men were away fighting or finding things. And there happened to be a lot of protests and riots about what they should do and what they should be able to do. The correspondence of Abigail Adams on women's rights. Abigail Adams remembered the ladies in the law's letters to her son. The first step in the fight for equal rights for women. She wants women to have a voice and be represented. Suggested that men have less power over the women, and she wrote letters in January of 1780. The assumptions of
Republicanism.
All power came from the people. Rhetoric of equality and given rights for them. The first state constitution, curbing executive power, limiting power of governors, revising state governments, Massachusetts Constitution, first change in the Massachusetts Constitution, and second strengthening the executive. Toleration of slavery, statute of religious liberty, separation, church and state, reason for slavery, persistence, the economic investments. And then the search for national government was the Confederation, diplomatic failures, the Confederations and the Northwest, Indians and Western lands, and debts, taxes, and Daniel Shays.
All right, thank you.
Legislative
All right. When it comes to the growing, the developing nation, you do know to be a good historian and to understand history very well, you've got to go back in time. It's just like case in point, I do think Thomas Jefferson had a moral problem with slavery, but he didn't know how to end it. Why would he not know how to end it? Huh? Why would Jefferson, an incredible mind, author, primary author, he had input and help, of course, but the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, it is a great document. Those who disparage the Declaration are usually people who are very uneducated, uninformed, and have an agenda, and they try to make documents fit their agenda. That's my quick version of that. But why did Jefferson, if he had a moral reservation, or aversion even, now of course he did have some slaves of his own, but why did he not end it?
It was too widespread.
Too what?
It was too widespread.
Too widespread. I think in Jefferson's, number one, he lived when he lived. That makes sense? Well, and so I always want you also to remember and think, okay, the events happening today, what will historians say about the year 2020 in America and in the world? How are they going to write that? How are they going to tell the story of what happened? Jefferson could not see a way to continue life as he knew it without slavery. He just couldn't grasp it. This was 1776. It's not like this was 1976, much less 2020. And so that's really a part of the issue that's going on. Make sure you understand, and as she gave us that high view of things, just like, well, let me get to the Declaration real quickly. Let me start where I ended. I did talk about the Intolerable Acts, the Coercive Acts, the Quartering Act, the Quebec Act. People around Quebec, in fact, that was one of the things that kind of stuck in the craw, if you will, of the colonists was much of the land around the Great Lakes was given back to the French to allow them to settle. And it was like, wait a minute, the French and Indian War, we kind of helped win that thing. Why are you giving away the land that we fought to gain access to? So, actually, true or false, English is the primary language in Quebec to this day. False. It's, the French culture was it was allowed to hang on there. And it was actually in 1774 that the British government took all of the country around the Great Lakes all the way to the Ohio River and put it in the province of Quebec. So it was allowed to be under French control. There were a lot of little things that led up to this revolution. The King of England, I think actually King George III was fairly immature as a person, just as a person, which makes him what type of king? Don't make it hard. Not a trick question. So therefore, as a ruler, as a king, he was immature. That makes sense? You bring who you are to whatever position you hold. We see that. Think about it. We see it in the presidents in our country. Wow, when you look back and you look at the presidents historically, even in recent history, it's like, oh, okay, gosh, they acted in the presidency basically the way they acted, thought, behaved elsewhere. Does that make sense? It's that we just are. Do you remember? You may not remember. One of the funny things out of George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency, his vice president was Dan Quayle. Now, you would have to have read that because it's well before your time, but when he was elected in '88, Dan Quayle, guess what? He was not a good speller in school, didn't necessarily make the highest grades in school, and he got ridiculed more than once for his poor spelling. He misspelled words. Now, is that the end of the world to misspell a word? No, but what does that say to people if you don't know how to spell words? Well, you're just not too bright. You are not the sharpest knife in the drawer. You're not the sharpest pencil in the pack. You know, you just, yeah, it just sends that message. Which is why I will forget history for just a second. That's why it matters. Okay? That's why it matters when you turn in papers. If there's a huge number of misspelled words, it's like, wow, you don't know, apparently. Number two, you didn't take the time to make sure you got it right. I mean, there's just a lot of bad things. When you interview with people, if you don't speak grammar correctly, English grammar, the first thing I'm hearing, and I've interviewed dozens, if not hundreds of people through the years, is like, wow, you don't even know what you're saying is wrong. I have did that for a long, long time. Doesn't that just sound? I hope that sounds wrong to you. You don't have did. What do you? I have done. The form of speech matters. How you put sentences together matters. Now the context is critical, but if we're having a formal conversation in a formal interview for a job, you understand, I mean, how many of you work? How many of you, or have worked, have had a job somewhere? Did you have an interview? Some type of interview, could have been. Now, how many of you, your job has been in Eden? Okay. How many of you know that the world is a little bit larger than Eden? You know what I mean? Eden has 1,200 people, more or less, give or take. Do you know how many live in San Angelo? About 95,000 to 100,000 people. So, I mean, when you, as you go to a larger place, and if you go to work there, it's real easy. That's why, to me, the critical thing about the founding of our country was these were educated men and women who were leading the charge for this revolution. When you know someone is intelligent, what do you tend to do? Believe them. I mean, you just say, wow, they've been to school longer, they've had, you know what I mean? So there's this default to believe, to follow. And most often, the most educated people are the ones who become people of influence, they become wealthy, and therefore the masses will follow. That's why it is not insignificant that the founders of our country, the leaders within our country, were wealthy men who were willing to sacrifice, men and women, their families, were willing to sacrifice for the cause of freedom, and it was that commitment that began to rally and galvanize and unify the colonies. I think the King of England, King George III, because of his immaturity, thought he could pick on the colony of Massachusetts without really any repercussions from the other colonies. Like I said, Prime Minister Grenville was the one who really thought the colonies were getting by with murder. King George III was not wise enough, mature enough to actually differentiate to the voices in his ear and to know really what was happening in the colonies. Virginia was the first colony to speak out against England's debacle, I'll call it, in Massachusetts. They had a day of fasting and prayer for Massachusetts to show that they were sympathetic and supportive. They wanted a meeting of the continental colonies, as they began to be known. The continental colonies, because they are where? On the continent, exactly. I mean, we're on a separate continent, not the European continent. We're on a separate continent. And then they started having meetings, and what did they call them? Conventions. Yeah, exactly. So Virginia really invited all of the continental colonies to meet in Philadelphia, what would become Pennsylvania, in October of 1774. They drew up a Declaration of Rights. That was the grievances. These were the things that they were irritated by and just were opposed to from England and King George. And they sent it to the king. They really planned to ban all imports. All importation of England goods was their original plan. If the king doesn't reply favorably by May of 1775, when did they meet? October of 1774. Why would you give such a long time? I mean, really? Can't you just text and tweet and be done with that? Send a picture on Instagram and say, here's what we want? Of course not, because of the lag time of communication, because of sea travel and the like. Anyway, they would meet again and go from there. So the British really wanted reconciliation. What they meant by reconciliation was, we want you to calm down and be quiet. They just wanted harmony to prevail. Why would so many Britishers...
But can you send Kiana with her things to the office, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye, Kiana. Somebody share your notes with her. So, what they really wanted was just the colonists to get back in line, to quit creating havoc and having these crazy ideas. However, there was a strain within England, within the government, that said, you know what, if they won't pipe down, let's use force. The king declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion. The reason he declared the colony of Massachusetts to be in rebellion, because that kind of kicked in certain other things within the British way of governing. That meant, number one, all civilian government would be abolished. And as rebels, they sent troops in to govern Massachusetts, cut off the trade of New England and the fishing business in all of New England. In response to this, the colonies began to collect guns, especially in Massachusetts. They gathered arms and were trained at Concord, and those were known as the who? The Minutemen, who were ready in a minute's notice to go to battle. So, Samuel Adams, leader of the Boston Tea Party, and John Hancock had a warrant issued for their arrest. The British set out to collect all of the civilian arms, to gather up all the guns, because guess what? If you don't have a gun, 1775, you're at the mercy of the one who does. Can I just remind you, that's still true. Historians, I believe, and this is my personal opinion, I think are going to scoff when they read about the defund the police movement. Are there police officers who need expulsion, who need to be arrested? Yes. Just like there are there are people in every walk of life who have been and who may need to be arrested for breaking the law, etc. That makes sense? Whatever law it might be. But to think that the answer is to not have a police force, listen to those arguments. Maybe I'll make that an extra credit assignment. To say we should have absolutely no law enforcement officials, I personally cannot fathom where anyone would think, well, that's a good idea. You know what will happen in a free society, we still live in a free society, if there are no law enforcement officials? What will it become like? I know we haven't covered this in U.S. history yet. What will it become like, though? Huh?
Dictatorship.
Well, if there's somebody powerful enough with enough military might behind him, yes, he could take over and become a dictator. But what will it look like in American history? There was a period of time that we functioned that way because there was very few. The nation was scattered out on the non-eastern seaboard. Beyond that in America, there were very few people, so there was very little law enforcement. What do we call that? It would become like a lot of those old shows on TV.
The Wild West.
The Wild West, the Old West. You bet. Everybody carried a gun. You took the law into your own hands. Maybe you got a posse together and rounded up to go get the bad guy, or who you thought was a bad guy, or who you told everybody was the bad guy. Exactly. I mean, that's the way it'll be. It'll become every person for themselves. Without a law enforcement presence. And besides that, I'll just climb up on my soapbox about that too, because that happened in the revolution as well. You've got to make sure you get down to the bottom line, the philosophical presuppositions, the ultimate goals of individuals who are spouting whatever philosophy. That makes sense? Now, what ended up happening, the colonists said we wanted what? Freedom. We were fighting because we were living under Taxation without representation. We were being abused and misused and not represented well and didn't have a voice, etc. So what did they create in the aftermath of that?
Declaration
Well, they made the Declaration of Independence, and then what?
of Constitution.
Ultimately, the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation, make sure you read that section in the textbook, was significant because it tried to create this government, but it had too many kinks and too many holes in it. And so ultimately, the Constitution of the United States of America was developed to do what? What is republicanism? Where does power reside in a republic?
The people.
With the people. And so to be true, was everything right and true and honest and accurate in the revolution? No, it wasn't. You know, I talked about the Boston Massacre, I think got overblown, and the goal was to drum up support and dislike of England. Now, were people killed? Yes, they were. But when the colonists were in charge in 1783, when Cornwallis surrendered, they actually created this government that was, you know the phrase from the Constitution? Of the people, by the people, for the people. They created that. So there wasn't this secret hidden agenda. They really wanted this self-rule. All right, back to the history. April 18, 1775, British troops under orders from the general residing in Boston set out to arrest Hancock and Adams. The colonists warned them, found out about that, to warn Lexington and Concord as to how the British were to arrive in the Old North Church, which I have walked into, kind of small place. They held what? Do you remember the sign? We're going to tell the countryside that the British are coming, one if by land, two if by sea. One lantern if they're coming on the land, two lanterns if they're coming by sea. And that was, of course, the setting and the context. They tried to stop them at Lexington. The colonists were defeated at Lexington. British destroyed Concord's supplies and really fought with the colonists at a creek, really behind Concord especially. I've actually visited that place as well. They end up retreating back to Boston. But what happened during this period? The midnight ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere did get on a horseback and he did ride to warn. And what was his warning? The British are coming. The British are coming. So April of 1775, the war actually officially begins. Since the last meeting was in October of 1774, the colonists had received nothing but trouble from England, so they decided to meet again as they had planned. And in the context of the warfare, in the context of warrants being issued for significant leaders in the colonies, it was determined that they would elect, they needed, at this Second Continental Congress, they needed a commander-in-chief, and who is elected because he's so well respected? George Washington. Washington had built a reputation. He didn't do everything right early in his career as a member of what army?
British.
The British Army, exactly. But he apparently was a man of integrity. He was one who was admired and respected. And so he was elected as commander-in-chief. I think a significant decision. There were other names put forth, but his rose to the top quickly. A significant decision. In fact, Washington would remain so well respected, he would become what? President. By acclamation. So, it was almost like, well, there's no other choice. Who else would we want to be the president of our country? So, in an effort to get other colonies involved, George Washington became commander-in-chief. That was the Committee of Correspondence is formed so that the colonies will know what others are doing concerning the war. There was literally a committee of correspondence to communicate back and forth. What do people have now, politicians and others, do? They may not have a formal committee of correspondence, but what do people who want to influence others or communicate with others have? Don't make this hard. Social media presence, exactly. And big corporations hire all kinds of, an enormous amount of people to maintain that web presence. That's all they do, is communicate and reply. So that was kind of the 1775 version of that. Most governors supported the king. Why would most governors of the colonies support the king?
That's where they got their money from.
Because they, what?
That's where they like got their money from.
They were appointed by the king. Now, who paid their salary?
King.
No, the colonists paid their salary. So while ultimately they supported the king because he had appointed them, they also had this angst because the colonists were actually the ones, it was the money from the colonists that was actually paying their salary. Many of them would be deported and replaced by the colonists. The Massachusetts militiamen would capture enormous amounts of guns, and basically they set them on a hill when they captured these guns, and it was known as Bunker Hill. And it was there that they drove the militia away and actually killed several members as well. Ultimately, the Minutemen and militiamen on Bunker Hill, I think the reason they didn't have greater success was because they ran out of ammunition. Gotta have bullets. January of 1776, Thomas Paine, who had lived in the colonies for about, between a year and two. Thomas Paine had not been here very long, coming here from England. He wrote what little pamphlet? Common Sense. What was it Common Sense about? Did you read your textbook? Why was it entitled Common Sense? The pamphlet urged and was very popular, widely distributed, but the pamphlet essentially said the colonists need to unite and separate from England. They need to stand up for their rights against the king, and it's nonsense to support a king when he is doing the things he has been doing to you. Finally, Thomas Paine would say it's only common sense to want to govern yourselves in light of the English way of doing government. That's what he tied it back to and said it's only common sense to do that. Thomas Paine really helped ignite and galvanize, I guess, the colonists' resolve to what? The I word was finally being said out loud in public among the colonists. What's the I word?
Independence.
Independence. Exactly. So that's really and that's why that book is so significant. And it did, quote, make sense to people. June of 1776, the Second Continental Congress meets to discuss the problems they face. Richard Henry Lee, the grandson, by the way, of Robert E. Lee, the grandfather of Robert E. Lee, makes a motion that colonies ought to be free and independent. On July the 2nd, 1776, is independence actually voted for with Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant young man who knows about laws and government and history. He was not a good speaker. Jefferson was not a good speaker. He would not have enjoyed presenting a PowerPoint presentation in history class, but he was a great writer. Benjamin Franklin was basically, I would call him an elderly, fun-loving man. Has a lot of stories about Benjamin Franklin out there who didn't really even stay at the meeting, but everyone else stays. Franklin had other things to do. He was busy discovering electricity. He didn't invent electricity, but he was this odd duck of a person, but he was basically fun-loving and fun to be around, but a creative type person. He didn't stay the whole time. Everybody else did. And they pretty much said, okay, Tom, you're really good at this. We're going to let you do it. And so he took over once Franklin actually left the meeting, I think. On July the 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read and approved, largely written by Jefferson. And the Declaration, three key parts of the Declaration of Independence. Number one, it contains a statement about the principal idea of government, how it ought to be, how government, the governing of people, should operate. Number 2, it's a list of grievances against King George III and his ill treatment of the colonists. We said, we got a bone to pick with you, and here they are. It's a long laundry list of their grievances. And number 3, it's an official statement of the separation, of their separation, and the intention of the colonists to seek independence. Let me, I hope, maybe not. Why am I not finding my mouse? There it is. I want to end the show, and I want the show. What time is it? I think I've got it. Am I up on the screen? Yay. Go. As soon as I find my body.
England's first permanent settlement in North America was named Jamestown in Virginia. It was 1607, and the migration and colonization of Great Britain continued. By the 1770s, 13 colonies had emerged. The colonists in America were citizens of Great Britain and subject to King George III, who appointed royal governors throughout the colonies. The colonies were the property of Great Britain, with whom they were required to trade and to whom the colonists were required to pay taxes. Increasing control from England was met with resistance. For example, Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which stated that the Americans needed to either pay for or provide lodging and support for British soldiers stationed in America. The colonists thought this was crazy. Another harsh tax came through the Stamp Act, which required that many printed materials in the colonies be produced on specially stamped paper produced in London. These materials included legal papers, magazines, newspapers, and playing cards. The Americans began to push back. They refused to buy British goods and trade with Great Britain. The bottom line is that the decision and taxes were being imposed upon these American colonists, and they had no vote, no control, no influence, and no representation in the Parliament of England. Complaints to the king were ignored. In Boston, Massachusetts, some colonists protested by disguising themselves as Indians. Sneaking aboard ships in the harbor, they dumped the cargo of tea into the seawater. The Boston Tea Party caused Great Britain to close the port and impose punishment for this rebellion. The other colonies also rebelled, which began the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. The Second Continental Congress was organized by delegates and representatives of the American colonies. These men gathered to decide what would and could be done to defend the rights and lives of the Americans against the tyranny of Great Britain. The committee included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson drafted a document which explained the purpose of the government, listed complaints and grievances against the king and the rule of Great Britain, proclaimed a declaration of war against the oppressors, announced the intent of the American colonies to separate from control of the king and rule of Great Britain, a Declaration of Independence. Independence to the Americans meant they wanted to govern themselves and establish their own government without interference from the King of Britain. One of the most famous lines in history summed up what they wanted.
All right.
It is included in the preamble, and it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Declaration of Independence is considered to be the founding document of American history. These people wanted nothing less that people want today, to live in peace and prosperity. The Declaration of Independence also summarized the abuses imposed by King George III and the British. Interference with the colonists who wanted to have their own government, charging taxes on the colonists without cause or reason, taking away their right to have a trial by jury. They were not permitted to trade freely. American ships were seized at seas, and people, called mercenaries, were hired by the king to fight against the colonists. The Declaration of Independence was ratified by the Congress on July 4th, 1776. That was our Independence Day. Of all the signatures, John Hancock stands out as the most prominent. It's as though he was screaming out across the ocean to Great Britain, "Hey, King, you are no longer over us." The Revolutionary War would continue to be fought until the American colonists got their point understood. They would not surrender. They would not quit. They were no longer subjects of King George III of Great Britain.
All right, let me give you some the background of the Declaration of Independence. You do well to read it again in the back of your book. Was a writer and philosopher in England by the name of John Locke, L-O-C-K-E. He actually lived decades before the Revolution, but it was his explanation of the revolution that took place in England in 1689, almost a century before. And in that, Locke, in trying to describe why there was this revolution in England, why King James II was ousted, his daughter Mary, who was married to her cousin William, came to power thereafter. He wrote 4 critical elements. Number 1, Locke said there are God-given natural laws that exist. Isn't made by government, isn't created by government. There are God-given natural laws that exist in the universe. Number 2, people have certain natural rights, God-given rights. What does our Declaration say? Inalienable rights. They are inherent in being a person. And they are, among them are what? Life, liberty. Locke said property. Thomas Jefferson at the Congress said what? Pursuit of happiness. That's really the only, but life, liberty came out, pursuit of happiness. Number 3, government has created a compact or a contract. Number 1, people among themselves create a compact. You know, the Mayflower Compact. Compact is another word for contract. And secondly, people have a contract with the rulers. Both have responsibilities to the other, so that any government is the people have a contract with each other and with the government. The government also has a contract with the people. Are you with me? It's a two-sided responsibility. And number 4, Locke's assertion was that the right of rebellion is allowed, permissible, even encouraged if one party breaks the contract. That is what our founding fathers were doing with the Declaration, basically telling the world why this rebellion was happening. So, their philosophy of government, remember those 3 things? The philosophy of government, why it exists. Number 2, the abuses. The word that's used is usurpations. The abuses by King George III. And then lastly, that official statement of we are separated. The interesting part at the time, is the bell about to ring? Interesting part. 10% of Americans at the time of the Revolution were Tories. Who are Tories? Support the king. They're loyalists to the king. 40% were rebels, or otherwise known as patriots. Strong in Massachusetts, Virginia, and Connecticut in particular. Which leaves how many? 50% were kind of neutral. What were the 50% busy doing? Trying to feed their families, trying to feed themselves, trying to make a living. And so that was really the breakdown. But the 40% became united, vocal, and drew in the rest of them so that a revolution could actually take place. Make sure you study the book, make notes in the book, make sure you have notes from class, and clean your table, please. Y'all will spray it, I'll wipe it. How's that? Y'all will spray it, I'll wipe it down.